Have you ever wondered what happens when ancient warrior traditions collide with modern warfare? When the hunters of the mesas become the ghosts of no man's land? Before we begin this classified story, I need you to do something for me. First, comment below and tell me where you're watching this from. Your city, your state, your country. This community is growing, and I want to know who's helping spread these forgotten truths. Second, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel survives because of you, and without your support, these secret stories stay buried forever. Now, let's dive into one of the most impossible tales ever hidden from history books. The morning of October 17, 1918, arrived cold and merciless across the Argonne forest. Fog clung to the scorched earth like a burial shroud, wrapping itself around the shattered trees and abandoned trenches that stretched endlessly between the American and German lines. First Sergeant William Hayes of the 77th Infantry Division crouched in the mud, his breath forming ghostly clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. The orders had been clear: push forward, take the ridge, accept no retreat. But something had changed in the last 72 hours. Something the command hadn't accounted for, and something Hayes couldn't explain in any official report without sounding insane. The Germans had stopped shooting back. Not completely, but strategically, surgically. Their machine gun nests had gone silent one by one, their observation posts abandoned, their sharpshooters simply vanishing from positions they'd held for weeks. The Allied advance should have been swift, triumphant even. Instead, it had become a crawl through an increasingly disturbing mystery. Hayes had served since 1917, had seen young men torn apart by shrapnel, had watched poison gas turn soldiers into convulsing shadows of themselves. He thought he'd witnessed every horror this war could manufacture. He was wrong. The thing that terrified him now wasn't what he could see. It was what he couldn't. It was the whispers spreading through the ranks like trench fever, stories about a figure that moved through the German lines like smoke through fingers, leaving only silence and death in its wake. The men called him the Ghost, the Apache Ghost. Private James Mitchell, a radio man from Oklahoma, had been the first to see him. 3 days earlier, Mitchell had been manning his post in a shell crater when movement caught his eye near the German wire. Through his field glasses, he'd watched a lone figure moving across no man's land, not running or crawling, but walking upright, calmly, as if taking a morning stroll through the killing fields. Mitchell had rubbed his eyes, certain he was hallucinating from exhaustion. But the figure remained, getting closer to the German trench line with each impossible step. Then something happened that made Mitchell's blood turn to ice water. The figure simply disappeared. Not ducked behind cover, not dove into a crater. Vanished, as completely as if he'd never existed. 30 seconds later, a German sniper known to have killed at least 19 American soldiers over the past month fell silent forever. When Mitchell reported this to his commanding officer, he was laughed out of the dugout. Exhaustion, they said. Shell shock. The mind playing tricks in the gray zone between life and death that was the Western Front. But then Corporal David Sullivan saw him 2 days later. Then Private First Class Robert Chen. Then Lieutenant Thomas Bradford. Each time, the pattern was identical. A figure moving through impossible terrain with impossible confidence. A disappearance that defied physics. And then, minutes later, a German position going dark, permanently. Hayes had dismissed these reports initially. War did strange things to men's minds, made them see angels and demons where there were only bullets and mud. But then he'd received the intelligence report from division, the one that was never supposed to leave the command tent, the one that somehow ended up on his desk with a note scrawled in pencil across the top. Read this. Believe it or don't. But it's happening. The report detailed something unprecedented in modern warfare. Over a 72-hour period, the German 7th Army had lost 43 confirmed snipers, machine gun positions, and forward observers. Not to artillery, not to coordinated assault, not to anything the Allied forces had officially deployed. The losses were surgical, silent, and absolutely devastating to German tactical capabilities. What made it more disturbing was how they died, or more accurately, how they didn't. There were no bodies, no blood trails, no evidence of struggle. German patrols would arrive at positions that had been active moments before, only to find them empty. Rifles still loaded, coffee still warm, cigarettes still burning. But the men were gone, vanished into the fog and smoke of the battlefield as completely as if they'd been erased from existence. The German High Command had initially suspected desertion, a mass breakdown in morale. But deserters left tracks. They stole supplies. They made noise. These men left nothing. They simply ceased to exist. By October 16th, something had shifted in the German response. The laughter had stopped. The mockery of American fighting capabilities, the confident swagger of an army that had been holding its ground for months, all of it evaporated. German commanders began pulling back their best marksmen, consolidating their positions, doubling their watches. They were afraid. The rumors spreading through the German trenches spoke of something that couldn't be killed, something that moved between worlds, something that hunted hunters. They called him Der Geist, the Spirit. Some called him Der Apache Tod, the Apache Death. Hayes read the intelligence report 3 times, each reading making his hands shake more than the last. Because buried in the clinical language of military assessment, hidden between casualty figures and tactical analysis, was a name. A single name that had been spoken by 3 separate German prisoners during interrogation, each man claiming to have heard it whispered in their trenches, each man's eyes showing the same raw terror when they said it aloud. John Wolfkiller. The name meant nothing to Hayes initially, but then he'd done something he probably shouldn't have. He'd gone through the divisional roster, searching for anything close to that name. What he found made him question everything he thought he knew about the war he was fighting. Private First Class John Wolfkiller. Service number 579382. Enlisted July 4th, 1917, in Phoenix, Arizona. Age 24. Height 5 feet 9 inches. Weight 162 pounds. Blood type O positive. Next of kin listed as Eleanor Wolfkiller, White Mountain Apache Reservation, Arizona. Marksman qualification score, perfect. Advanced infantry training, completed. Assigned to 77th Infantry Division as a designated marksman. Status as of October 10th, 1918. Missing in action, presumed dead. Hayes had stared at that word, missing, until the letters seemed to blur and shift. The official report stated that Wolfkiller had been part of a nighttime reconnaissance patrol that had failed to return. 7 men had gone out into no man's land to gather intelligence on German positions. None came back. The assumption was that they'd been caught in a machine gun crossfire or hit by artillery. It happened. Men disappeared in this war. The mud and blood swallowed them whole. But that was October 10th. The ghost sightings had started on October 11th. The German casualties began accumulating on October 12th. And now, 5 days later, the pattern had become undeniable. Something or someone was systematically dismantling German forward positions with a precision and lethality that bordered on supernatural. Hayes had tried to dismiss it as coincidence. Apache soldiers were serving with distinction throughout the American forces. Several had been killed in action. Perhaps the Germans had simply started calling any unknown threat by a name that frightened them, that played into their growing paranoia about American tribal warriors. The propaganda had been circulating for months. Stories about Indian soldiers who could move like shadows, who knew the old ways of war, who brought ancient terrors to modern battlefields. But then Hayes had found the second document. This one hadn't come through official channels. It had been slipped into his field pack by someone who never identified themselves, appearing during a supply run and disappearing before Hayes could ask questions. The document was typed on German military letterhead, clearly stolen or recovered from captured correspondence. It was dated October 14, 1918, and addressed to German Artillery Command from an officer whose name had been redacted. Hayes had it translated by a sergeant who'd grown up in a German-speaking neighborhood in Milwaukee. The sergeant's voice had trembled as he read the words aloud. "We are no longer fighting an army. We are being hunted by a demon. He appears from nowhere. Our finest snipers see nothing before they die. Our machine gunners fire at shadows. He kills without sound, without trace, without mercy. Yesterday we found Sergeant Klaus, our best marksman, a man who had survived Verdun, dead in his nest. His rifle was clean. His position was perfect. His eyes were open. But his spirit was gone. There were marks on the ground around him, tracks in the mud that our tracker claims are impossible. He says they are the footprints of a man who weighs nothing, who leaves no scent, who moves between the spaces where air meets earth. I do not believe in ghosts, Herr Kommandant, but I believe in fear. And this thing, this American Apache, has made our men afraid to sleep, afraid to look through their scopes, afraid to hold their positions. They say he speaks to them before he kills them. They say he whispers in a language older than any war. They say he gives them a choice: run or join the dead. Most are choosing to run." The sergeant had finished reading and handed the paper back to Hayes without comment. His eyes said everything his mouth wouldn't. This was beyond tactics, beyond strategy, beyond anything their training had prepared them for. Hayes had spent the rest of that day trying to verify the impossible. He'd talked to scouts, medics, anyone who might have information about what was actually happening in no man's land. What he pieced together read like something from a pulp magazine, the kind of Wild West story his grandfather used to tell about Apache warriors in the Arizona Territory, the ones who could track a man across solid rock, who could disappear into landscapes that offered no cover, who turned hunting into an art form that terrified the U.S. cavalry for decades. According to every account Hayes could gather, this is what happened. John Wolfkiller hadn't died with his patrol on October 10th. He'd survived. The others, all 6 of them, had been killed instantly by a German machine gun nest that had been waiting in ambush. Wolfkiller had been hit twice, once in the left shoulder, once in the right thigh, but he hadn't gone down. Or if he had, he'd gotten back up. In the chaos and darkness, the Germans had assumed all 7 Americans were dead and had returned to their trenches to report a successful engagement. What they hadn't known was that John Wolfkiller came from a line of warriors who'd fought Mexican armies, American cavalry, and Apache enemies for generations. His grandfather had ridden with Geronimo. His father had been a scout for the U.S. Army during the last Apache campaigns. Wolfkiller had grown up learning skills that most modern soldiers considered obsolete: tracking, stalking, moving through hostile territory with nothing but instinct and tradition. And now, wounded and alone behind enemy lines, those skills had transformed him into something the Germans had no frame of reference for. He wasn't fighting with American tactics. He wasn't following American doctrine. He'd reverted to something older, something primal, something that turned modern warfare on its head. He'd gone hunting, The first confirmed kill happened on the night of October 11th, exactly 14 hours after Wolf Killer's patrol was presumed wiped out. A German sniper named Friedrich Hartmann, credited with 37 Allied kills, was found in his carefully concealed position overlooking the American trenches. His spotter, a young corporal from Munich named Ernst Weber, survived long enough to give a statement to his commanding officer before succumbing to what the field surgeon could only describe as complete psychological collapse. Weber's testimony was recorded in a field journal that would later be confiscated by German intelligence and then, mysteriously, obtained by American forces. The translation, rough and hurried, captured something that would haunt every soldier who read it. He came from below. Not from the direction we were watching. From below, underneath the earth itself. We heard nothing. Friedrich was looking through his scope, tracking an American officer near their communication trench. I was beside him, recording positions in my notebook. Then Friedrich made a sound. Not a scream. Not a word. Just a sound, like air escaping from a punctured tire. When I turned to look at him, he was staring at something behind me. His face was white. His hands were shaking. I started to turn, to see what had terrified him so completely. But then I heard the voice. It spoke in German, but the accent was like nothing I had ever heard. Deep, old, patient. It said, "You have two choices. You can run back to your lines and tell them the Apache ghost is hunting, or you can stay here and become another story they whisper about in the dark. Choose now." I chose to run. God forgive me. I chose to run. I dropped my rifle and I ran. And behind me, I heard Friedrich scream once. Just once. And then silence. When I looked back, the figure was gone. Friedrich was gone. The only thing left was his helmet, sitting perfectly upright on the sandbags, and inside it, written in charcoal, were words in a language I did not recognize. Our translator, an Austrian professor conscripted into service, looked at those words for a long time before telling us what they meant. They were Apache. They said, "The hunt has begun." Hayes had read that testimony 4 times before he allowed himself to believe it might be real. The implications were staggering. If Wolf Killer was alive, wounded, and operating alone behind German lines, he wasn't fighting a conventional war anymore. He was conducting something far more terrifying, a one-man campaign of psychological warfare that was systematically destroying German morale and tactical effectiveness. But how? The question consumed Hayes. How could one man, even a highly trained marksman, even a soldier with traditional Apache hunting skills, accomplish what entire battalions couldn't? How could he move through defended territory without being spotted, tracked, or killed? How could he take out hardened snipers and machine gun positions without leaving evidence? The answer came from an unexpected source. Captain Daniel Redfeather, a Lakota officer serving with the 91st Division, had been temporarily attached to Hayes's unit to provide linguistic support for Choctaw code talkers. When Redfeather heard the stories circulating about the Apache ghost, he'd requested a private meeting with Hayes. What he shared changed everything Hayes thought he understood about modern warfare. "My grandfather fought in the Indian Wars," Redfeather had said, sitting across from Hayes in a dugout that smelled of wet earth and cigarette smoke. "He fought against the army, and then he fought for the army. He told me stories about Apache warriors, about how they waged war differently than any other tribe. They didn't fight battles. They fought campaigns. Long, patient, terrifying campaigns that broke their enemies psychologically before ever engaging them physically." Hayes had leaned forward, listening intently. Redfeather continued, "An Apache warrior could track a man across rock. He could predict where his enemy would be 3 days before the enemy knew it himself. He could survive on almost nothing, move through territory that offered no cover, and remain invisible even when standing in plain sight. They mastered something the army never understood: the difference between looking and seeing. A soldier looks for threats. An Apache warrior understands the landscape so completely that he becomes part of it. He doesn't hide from you. He simply exists in the spaces between your expectations. And if this wolf killer comes from that tradition, Redfeather had said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, then the Germans aren't fighting a soldier. They're being hunted by someone who learned warfare from men who made the U.S. cavalry terrified to patrol Arizona territory. They're being hunted by someone who knows that the most powerful weapon isn't a rifle. It's fear. Hayes had thanked Redfeather and spent the rest of that night trying to comprehend what it meant. The Germans had laughed initially when intelligence reports suggested an Apache soldier was operating behind their lines. They'd mocked it as American desperation, primitive warfare in a modern age, savagery trying to compete with German military precision. But the laughter had died quickly, because Wolf Killer wasn't fighting with primitive tactics. He was using ancient principles applied to contemporary warfare in ways no military academy had ever conceived. The pattern of kills revealed a strategy so sophisticated it seemed impossible for one man to execute. Wolf Killer wasn't randomly targeting German positions. He was systematically dismantling their observation network from the inside out. He started with the forward scouts, the men who provided early warning. Then he moved to the snipers, eliminating the Germans' ability to cover their own lines. Finally, he targeted communication runners and officers, severing the connections between units and creating confusion that spread like poison through their ranks. But it was how he killed them that truly terrified the German forces. There was no pattern, no predictable method. Each death was different, tailored to the victim, designed to maximize the psychological impact on whoever discovered the body or heard the story. Some men were found with their weapons disassembled, the parts arranged in patterns that meant nothing to German soldiers, but everything to anyone who understood Apache symbolism. Others simply vanished, leaving behind only personal items arranged in ways that suggested they'd left willingly, calmly, as if answering a call only they could hear. One German machine gun crew was discovered by their relief team, all 4 men alive but completely unresponsive, sitting at their position with their eyes open and staring at nothing. They never spoke again. Whatever they'd seen or experienced had broken something fundamental in their minds. The only clue was a series of marks in the mud around their position, tracks that the German tracker, a hunter from the Black Forest with 20 years' experience, claimed belonged to a man who moved like water, who distributed his weight so perfectly that he left almost no impression, who could have walked within arm's reach of the crew without disturbing a single sound. By October 16th, the German High Command was facing something unprecedented. Their men were refusing to hold forward positions. Sentries were abandoning their posts, even veteran soldiers, men who'd survived years of brutal trench warfare, were showing signs of complete psychological breakdown when ordered into the sectors where the Apache ghost had been reported. German commanders attempted to suppress the stories, to maintain discipline through traditional military order. It failed spectacularly. You couldn't order men to stop believing in something they could see evidence of with their own eyes. You couldn't court-martial soldiers for cowardice when their alternative was being hunted by something that killed from impossible angles, that left messages in languages none of them understood, that turned their own defensive positions into elaborate traps that snapped shut with lethal precision. The Americans, meanwhile, were experiencing their own crisis of understanding. While German morale crumbled, Allied commanders struggled to explain what was happening. Official reports attributed the German collapse to sustained artillery pressure, successful infantry advances, and deteriorating supply lines. But the soldiers in the trenches knew better. They'd seen the fear in German prisoners' eyes. They'd heard the stories spreading through both sides of no man's land. They knew that something extraordinary was happening, something that defied conventional military explanation. Private Marcus Webb, a scout from Texas who'd grown up hunting in the hill country, had his own encounter with the Apache ghost on October 17th. He'd been on a forward observation mission, crawling through a maze of shell craters and barbed wire to gather intelligence on German trench layouts. As dawn broke, painting the devastated landscape in shades of gray and crimson, Webb had taken shelter in an abandoned German dugout to wait out the daylight hours. He'd been there for maybe 30 minutes when he heard movement above him. Not the heavy footsteps of German patrols, something lighter, more deliberate. Webb had frozen, his hand on his pistol, barely breathing as the sound moved across the damaged ground above his hiding spot. Then, impossibly, a figure dropped into the dugout entrance. Webb's testimony, recorded later that day, captured what happened next with startling clarity. "I thought I was dead. I had my pistol half drawn when I realized the figure wasn't German. He was wearing pieces of American uniform mixed with things I couldn't identify. His face was painted with mud and what might have been charcoal, patterns that seemed to shift in the dim light. But it was his eyes that stopped me from shooting. They weren't the eyes of a man who'd been fighting for his life behind enemy lines for nearly a week. They were calm, focused, almost peaceful. He looked at me for what felt like an hour but was probably only seconds. Then he spoke in English, his voice hoarse but steady. 'You're far from your lines, Scout. This sector is being cleared. Return to your unit and tell them the ridge will be silent by nightfall. The German observers are being removed.' I must have looked confused because he smiled slightly, though there was no humor in it. 'Tell First Sergeant Hayes that Private Wolfkiller is completing his patrol mission. We were sent to gather intelligence on German positions. I'm gathering it.' Before I could respond, before I could ask how he was still alive or what he meant by clearing the sector, he was gone. Not climbed out. Not ran away. Gone. I searched that dugout after he left. There was only one entrance, but he'd vanished as completely as smoke in wind. The only evidence he'd been there at all was a small stone, no bigger than my thumb, placed on the ground where he'd been standing. It was carved with symbols I didn't recognize. When I showed that stone to Captain Redfeather later, he held it for a long time without speaking. Finally, he said it was a hunting token, something Apache warriors would leave to mark territory they'd claimed. He said it meant Wolfkiller considered that entire sector his hunting ground now. He said the Germans there were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. He was right. By 1900 hours that evening, every German observation post within 500 yards of Webb's position had gone silent. No gunfire, no explosions, just silence, spreading across the battlefield like a void swallowing sound itself. The German response grew increasingly desperate. They brought in their best counter-sniper teams, veterans from the Eastern Front who'd hunted Russian marksmen through the ruins of shattered cities. They established overlapping fields of fire, consolidated their positions, implemented protocols designed to make infiltration impossible. Nothing worked. Wolfkiller moved through their defenses as if they didn't exist. He killed their hunters. He evaded their traps. He turned every tactical advantage they possessed into a liability that bred more fear, more confusion, more collapse. On October 18th, a German colonel named Victor Steiner, a decorated officer with impeccable credentials and a reputation for cold rationality, sent a message to his superiors that would later be suppressed from official records, but would circulate through military intelligence channels for years afterward. The message was brief, clinical, and absolutely chilling in its implications. We are no longer engaged in combat operations against American forces in this sector. We are attempting to survive an extermination campaign conducted by a single enemy combatant who has demonstrated capabilities that exceed all known parameters of human performance. This soldier, identified through multiple sources as Private John Wolfkiller of the American 77th Division, has systematically destroyed our tactical infrastructure through methods that combine ancient hunting traditions with intimate knowledge of modern military vulnerabilities. He does not fight. He exterminates. He does not engage. He eliminates. In 6 days of operation, he has accomplished what American artillery and infantry assaults failed to achieve in 6 weeks. Our forward positions are untenable. Our men are psychologically compromised. I am recommending immediate strategic withdrawal from this sector before complete unit collapse becomes inevitable. The recommendation was denied. German High Command couldn't accept that a single American soldier, particularly one from what they considered a primitive indigenous culture, could force a strategic withdrawal of veteran German troops. Pride, prejudice, and military doctrine all insisted it was impossible. They ordered Steiner to hold his ground, to restore discipline, to eliminate this threat through overwhelming force. Steiner died 3 days later. The official report stated he'd been killed by American artillery. The truth, whispered among the survivors of his unit, was far different. He'd been found in his command bunker 20 feet underground, surrounded by guards and defensive positions. But he'd been alone when they found him. His guards had vanished. His defensive positions were empty. And on the wall of his bunker, written in what forensic analysis later confirmed was Steiner's own blood, were words in Apache that required a specialized translator to interpret. The translation read, "The hunted become the hunters. The hunters become the prey. The cycle is eternal. The war is not." Hayes received confirmation of Steiner's death on October 21st, and with it came orders he'd been dreading. Command wanted Wolfkiller extracted. They wanted him pulled back to friendly lines, debriefed, assessed, and potentially deployed to other sectors where his unique skills could be utilized. Hayes understood the strategic logic. He also understood it was impossible. You didn't extract a warrior who'd transformed himself into a living ghost. You didn't debrief someone who'd crossed a line between soldier and something else entirely. And you certainly didn't reassign someone who'd found a purpose so complete, so absolute, that returning to conventional warfare would be like caging a wolf and expecting it to remain tame. Hayes sent 3 separate teams into no man's land with instructions to locate and communicate with Wolfkiller. All 3 returned with the same report. They'd found signs of his presence, markers that confirmed he was alive and continuing his campaign. But they never saw him, never made contact. The closest any team came was finding a message scratched into the stock of a recovered German rifle. The message read, "The mission continues. Do not follow. The hunt must finish." What haunted Hayes, what kept him awake during those final weeks of October 1918, wasn't whether Wolfkiller would succeed. The evidence made that clear. German positions were collapsing. Their lines were in retreat. The impossible strategy was working beyond anyone's wildest projections. What haunted Hayes was a different question entirely. When the war ended, if Wolfkiller survived, would he be able to stop? Would he be able to return to being a soldier in a peacetime army? Or had the transformation been too complete, too fundamental, turning him into something that could only exist in the spaces between civilization and chaos? The answer came on November 7th, 1918, 4 days before the armistice that would end the war. A German patrol, one of the last still operating in the sector, encountered an American soldier walking toward their lines with his hands raised in apparent surrender. The Germans, exhausted and terrified, nearly shot him on sight. But something stopped them. Maybe it was the way he moved, with absolute confidence despite being surrounded by armed enemies. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, calm and utterly fearless. Maybe it was the recognition that this was the man they'd been hunting, the ghost that had destroyed their entire defensive network. The German officer in charge, a lieutenant named Hans Becker, who survived the war and would later provide testimony during post-war interviews, described what happened next in detail that bordered on obsessive. He stood there in no man's land, this American soldier, and he looked at each of us in turn. Not with hatred, not with triumph, with something I can only describe as understanding. Then he spoke to us in German, perfect German, and he said, "The war is ending. You can go home now. Your positions are empty. Your snipers are gone. Your machine guns are silent. I have completed what I came to do. You are free to leave." We didn't believe him at first. How could we? But when we returned to our lines, we found exactly what he'd said. Every position we'd held, every defensive point we'd maintained, all of them were indefensible now. Not because they'd been destroyed by artillery or captured by infantry, but because the network that supported them, the observers and gunners and communications personnel who made those positions viable, they were all gone. Removed surgically over 3 weeks by this one man who decided that was his mission. We retreated that night. Not in panic, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement that we'd been beaten by something we had no framework to understand. We'd been hunted by a hunter who transformed modern warfare into an ancient ritual. And we'd lost absolutely. The last confirmed sighting of Private John Wolfkiller came on November 11th, 1918, the day the armistice took effect. Multiple sources, both American and German, reported seeing a lone figure walking east across the battlefield as the guns fell silent. He was heading toward the sunrise, away from both armies, carrying only a rifle and a small pack. Soldiers from both sides watched him go. Nobody tried to stop him. Nobody called out. They simply watched as he disappeared into the morning mist, becoming once again what he'd been throughout his impossible campaign. A ghost, a legend, a story that would be told and retold but never fully believed. The official Army records list Private First Class John Wolfkiller as missing in action, presumed killed October 10th, 1918. His name is engraved on the memorial wall at the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery. His family received notification of his death and, years later, a posthumous Silver Star for valor in combat. The citation mentions his service as a designated marksman and his participation in reconnaissance operations. It says nothing about what he actually accomplished. Nothing about the strategy that shouldn't have worked. Nothing about the 3 weeks when one man held an entire sector through methods that military analysts still struggle to explain. But the stories persisted. In the years after the war, veterans would gather and share accounts they'd heard about the Apache ghost. German soldiers spoke of him in hushed tones, describing something that haunted their nightmares long after the guns stopped firing. American troops told their children about the soldier who went into no man's land and never came back, who fought a war within a war, who became something that transcended the uniforms and flags and national boundaries that defined conventional conflict. Some claim to have seen him again, a figure matching his description, always alone, always moving with purpose, spotted in border regions and remote territories across the American Southwest throughout the 1920s and 30s. a man who appeared during times of conflict, who helped tribal communities defend their land, who vanished before authorities could identify him. These reports were dismissed as folklore, the kind of legends that grow around any mysterious figure. But they never completely died. They persisted, spreading through communities that understood the difference between myth and memory. In 1943, during the Second World War, an incident occurred in the Pacific Theater that rekindled interest in the wolf killer story. A Japanese garrison on a remote island reported being systematically dismantled by an unknown assailant who used tactics that intelligence officers described as eerily similar to those employed in the Argonne Forest 25 years earlier. The attacker was never identified. The garrison was found abandoned, the soldiers having fled into the jungle rather than face whatever was hunting them. On the wall of their command post, investigators found symbols carved into the wood. Apache symbols that translated to, "The cycle continues." Was it Wolf Killer? Could he have survived, aged, and continued fighting in another war a quarter-century later? The possibility seemed absurd. Yet the evidence, the methods, the psychological impact, all of it matched the pattern established in 1918. Military historians have debated this for decades without reaching consensus. The official position remains that it was a coincidence, different soldiers using similar unconventional tactics in different wars. But those who study the evidence, who read the reports and testimonies and translations, who understand the depth of tradition that shaped Apache warriors, they're less certain. They point out that someone trained from childhood in specific methods of warfare wouldn't simply abandon them. They note that the time frame, while long, wasn't impossible. They observe that both incidents occurred during American military operations, and both resulted in enemy forces experiencing the same type of psychological collapse. Most significantly, they reference the accounts from Apache communities throughout the Southwest, stories passed down through families about a warrior who went to fight in the white man's war and came back changed, who couldn't settle into peacetime, who walked the old paths and lived the old ways, who appeared when needed and disappeared when the threat passed. These stories describe a man who'd mastered the space between two worlds, who embodied both ancient tradition and modern capability, who'd become something that could exist in either era, but belonged fully to neither. The truth, if it exists, remains hidden in classified files and fading memories. What's undeniable is the impact. The strategy that the Germans laughed at, the Apache soldier they mocked as primitive became one of the most effective psychological warfare campaigns of World War I. One man, operating alone behind enemy lines, forced a strategic withdrawal of veteran troops through methods that military academies still study and struggle to replicate. And somewhere, in the spaces between documented history and whispered legend, the question remains: did John Wolfkiller die on that battlefield in October 1918? Or did he simply continue his patrol, extending it across decades and conflicts, becoming a permanent ghost in the machine of modern warfare? Did the hunt ever truly end? Or is it still continuing, invisible to those who don't know how to look, carried on by someone or something that transcended the boundaries between soldier and warrior, between contemporary combat and ancient tradition? The men who served in the Argonne Forest in October of 1918, both American and German, went to their graves without fully answering that question. They'd seen too much, experienced too much, to dismiss it as simple folklore. They knew that something impossible had occurred, something that challenged their understanding of what was achievable in warfare. They knew that a man they'd presumed dead had accomplished the impossible by refusing to fight the war everyone else was fighting. He'd waged his own campaign, following rules older than military doctrine, achieving objectives through methods that existed before uniforms and rank structures and national armies. And in doing so, he'd proven something that military leaders spend lifetimes trying to understand. That technology and numbers and industrial might, as important as they are, can be neutralized by someone who understands the fundamental truth of all conflict. War isn't won by the side with better weapons. It's won by the side that better understands fear, that controls the psychological battlefield, that transforms the space between combatants into terrain that favors the hunter over the hunted. The Germans laughed at the Apache sniper. They mocked the idea that ancient traditions could threaten modern military power. They learned, too late, that some strategies transcend time, that some warriors carry within them capabilities that no amount of technological advancement can overcome, that the oldest form of warfare, one human hunting another across hostile ground, remains as effective in 1918 as it was 1,000 years before. As you contemplate this story, as you consider whether to believe it or dismiss it as wartime legend amplified by fear and fog, remember this. Right now, at this moment, there are places in this world where similar things may be happening. Conflicts where someone trained in methods most people consider obsolete is achieving results that seem impossible. Situations where ancient knowledge is being applied to contemporary problems with devastating effectiveness. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere out there, the patrol continues. The hunt endures. The ghost walks on. We live in a world that wants clear answers, documented proof, official confirmation. But some truths exist in the spaces between certainty and doubt. In the stories soldiers tell each other when the cameras are off and the reports are filed. Some truths are too strange for history books, but too persistent to ignore. The Apache ghost of the Argonne Forest is one of those truths. And if you listen carefully to the stories veterans tell, if you pay attention to the accounts that never quite make it into official histories, you might start to recognize the pattern. You might start to see the signs that something impossible is still out there, still operating, still proving that the old ways never truly die. They just wait for someone skilled enough, dedicated enough, desperate enough to resurrect them. And when that happens, when ancient warfare meets modern conflict, the results are exactly what occurred in October of 1918. The hunters become the hunted. The impossible becomes inevitable. And somewhere, a ghost continues his patrol through territory that exists between memory and myth, between history and legend, between what we know happened and what we can't quite believe. In times of darkness, when evil seems overwhelming and hope appears lost, remember that throughout history, individuals have risen to stand against impossible odds. They found strength not just in their training or their weapons, but in something deeper, in faith, in purpose, in the understanding that we are all part of something greater than ourselves. John Wolfkiller, whether he lived or died, whether his story is fact or legend, represents something eternal. The idea that one person, guided by principle and tradition, empowered by connection to something beyond the material world, can change the course of events in ways that seem miraculous. This world is full of darkness, but it's also full of light for those willing to seek it. When you feel hunted by circumstance, when life seems to have you surrounded, remember that you have access to strength beyond your own understanding. Turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ. Find in faith what Wolfkiller found in tradition: the power to persist when persistence seems impossible, the courage to continue when continuation seems futile, the wisdom to see paths that others miss because they're looking in the wrong direction. Evil hunts us all in different ways, but we are not defenseless. We are not abandoned. We are children of a God who conquered death itself, who offers victory over darkness, who promises that no matter how impossible the situation seems, there is always a way forward for those who trust in divine guidance. Seek that guidance. Accept that grace. Let faith transform you into something that fear cannot touch, that despair cannot break, that darkness cannot overcome. The Apache ghost walked into no man's land and returned changed. You too can walk into the darkest moments of your life and emerge transformed, not through your strength alone, but through connection to the eternal source of all strength, through Jesus Christ, who fought the ultimate battle and won the ultimate victory. Trust in Him. Follow Him. Let His light guide you through whatever warfare you face, whether on battlefields of earth or in the struggles of your soul. Because at the end of all stories, there is only one truth that matters. God is real. His love is infinite. And through Him, all impossible things become possible. The hunt may continue, but so does grace. So does hope. So does the promise that no matter how lost we become, no matter how far behind enemy lines we find ourselves, we are never alone. We are never abandoned. We are always, always capable of finding our way home.